All right, so welcome back to the Stylistic coaching series. This is episode two, the first real episode. We're talking about wide threat bubbles versus top heavy teams. I am breaking up this episode into two parts. This is the wide threat bubble part, mainly because I wanted some content up before the draft is finished, and this is just what I had done already. So let's get into it. So I just want to start with an overview of the typical pros and cons of wide threat bubble teams and top heavy teams. Um, these teams are certainly not always going to follow, um, have these strengths, have these weaknesses, but it's just what I think to be the general trade-offs for drafting wide and drafting top heavy. So on a wide threat bubble team, you're going to have more bringable Pokemon. So, you know, you're going to have a lot more Pokemon that you feel, maybe you're not bringing them every week, but you're maybe more likely to consider them every week. It's just subjective what bringable means, and I think we'll see that with some of the examples. You're typically more flexible in prep as well, um, and that's just because you have more bringable Pokemon. Um, you know, you might have multiple Pokemon that work for a situation. You might have, multiple different modes that are strong in a given week, and it gives your opponent more stuff to focus on, and you just have a lot more options to work with typically. The downsides, typically, you're going to have less or less strong top tiers, and that's just because if you're spending more points at the bottom of your roster, you are spending less points at the top of your roster. Um, so typically your top tiers are going to be lesser in number or lesser in power. Um, and you also have to bring some more flawed Pokemon. So I wouldn't call my last season team particularly wide, but just for whether you're here or not, I'll just I brought Morpeko multiple times last season. If you need to take a second to look at Morpeko, look at its stats, look at what it does. It has some severe flaws. I did bring it multiple times. It was good when I brought it too. So this is certainly not like the worst thing to have happen to your team. Um, but yeah, I had to bring Morpeko despite its extreme flaws. Whereas if I was bringing the same 7 or 8 Pokemon every week, maybe my eighth best Pokemon is not a super flawed Pokemon, at least not as flawed as Morpeko. Um, so that's a slight trade-off. And then top heavy teams, they have more top tiers or stronger top tiers because they're spending more points at the top. That's why their teams are top heavy. Um, they have stronger synergistic combos. So what I mean by this is, your top heavy teams, since you're spending so many points at the top, you're more likely to have stronger or a greater quantity of like really great 1-2 punch combos. Your Indeedee Hats of the world in the Dynamax era. I mean, Indeedee Hat, like now it's not quite as great. Um, also in Dynamax, like anything with Metagross, like Metagross Spectra or stuff like that. Um, yeah. So you're more likely to have those like superstar combos on your top heavy teams, which are really great. But you're also a little more predictable in prep because you're centered around fewer Pokemon and you're centered around, specific like 1 or 2 huge big hitter threats. Um, so the opponents know more what they need to beat in order to beat you. And then the other slight negative is that you have less options in unfavorable matchups. So what I mean by this is if you're a Metagross team and you're against, Sableye, the best burn Pokemon in the game, um, and let's say your other Pokemon is, let's say the Sableye team has like a Regieleki, and your team is like Metagross and some random water type. I don't know. That's not Tapu Fini. Um, the Sableye and Regieleki are going to pose significant problems, and then since you have to utilize Pokemon that are not your best Pokemon, you're going to struggle since your low tiers are so weak. Top heavy teams, the low tiers are typically much weaker, so it's harder to pivot out of your strongest options if they have poor matchups. Whereas in a wide threat bubble team, if your best Pokemon has a tough matchup, you have maybe eight or nine Pokemon that are willing to take its place. Um, so that's a slight trade-off as well. And then just before I continue, I don't want to. I'm not passing any judgment on these teams. Wide threat bubbles are great. Top-heavy teams are great. Both teams are great. Both teams can certainly win championship. Both teams can be bad if they're drafted poorly. I mean, there's nothing inherently good or bad about wide threat bubbles and top-heavy teams. They're just different sides of a spectrum. And that's the other point. They're a spectrum. Most coaches fall like pretty in the middle of these terms. Like most teams take advantage of the high tiers, the mid tiers, and the low tiers. Um, they have bringable Pokemon, but they also have some superstars. Um, but there are some teams that go really into the top heavy, and there are some teams that go really into the wide threat bubble. And that's what we are going to talk about, you know, how to maximize those things. Sorry. So wide threat bubble drafts, we're going to look at a great one, we're going to look at a suboptimal one, and we're going to talk about them. What else to do but talk and analyze? That's our favorite thing to do. So here's Daddy's season 5 team. OMG, it's Daddy, our favorite coach. He went 6-1, so this is a very successful season. Don't want to look at it too much. I just want you, especially if you've never seen it before, I want you to just get a look at it before we get into our analysis. Um, and then here's the worst team. This is Daddy's season 6 team, went 1-6. So the opposite end of the spectrum. Let's take a look at this. Um, yeah, this. So for reference, the previous team was in a BDSP format, so lower power, and this is a like general Swish format, so higher, quite high power format. Both are non-max. Um, so yeah, have enough time to look at this. So what are we learning? So what do we want to do? We want diverse sweeping and support options. So let's take a look at Daddy's first team. Um, let's look at the sweeping options. Camerupt, you know, the special attack isn't huge, but it's big enough, especially with eruption. Definitely count that as a more low mid tier sweeper, but it is a sweeper. Crawdont sweeper, Cress not really, but it can set up, so it's not a sweeper. But Electivire certainly is a sweeper. Leafeon can be a sweeper in Sun. Porygon Z is definitely a sweeper. Purugly we'll get to in a second, can sweep. Typhlosion is a sweeper. So that's not counting Crest, I think that was 7. So crazy amount of sweeping options. Absolutely crazy. Um, and then support, we actually don't have too many dedicated supports. It's Crest and Lumais. But they're really strong supports and they support the whole team. They work with basically everything on the team and they have a lot of different ways that they can support the team. And then also niche support options. Porygon Z has some stuff it can do. Purugly has mostly fake out support. But fake out support is huge. So Purugly has some support it can do for the team as well. And then Ghastly too. I would say Ghastly is borderline bringable. Um, I'm not going to talk about the stupid rat because it's not bringable. That's the only Pokemon on this team, the rat, that I would say is certainly not bringable. Um, okay, yeah. So we covered diverse sweeping and support options. I would say this team has it. Um, just before we move on to the next point, let's look at this team because I found something interesting. So we do see pretty diverse sweeping options. Blaziken, Phalanx, maybe Executor, Hat, definitely, maybe Inteleon, probably not Pincurchin, but maybe Raichu, probably, I mean, Raichu, yes. So quite a few options, but let's look at the support. Indeedee, huge. Phalanx wants Indeedee, Blaziken wants Indeedee, Hat wants Indeedee, Inteleon might want Indeedee, even Raichu might want Indeedee. Articuno could probably, Articuno is too weak, but it doesn't hate Indeedee next to it. Everything likes Indeedee next to it, so Indeedee gets the seal of approval. Articuno, however, that's Tailwind support. What is it supporting? Inteleon, Raichu are faster, so the Tailwind's not quite doing enough for them. Indeedee is the same speed, so similar problem, and Indeedee is not like a dedicated sweeper. At least it shouldn't be, so Tailwind's not doing much for any of those three. Blaziken has built-in speed control. It's much easier to protect Blaziken and have it at +1 than deal with Articuno setting up Tailwind at 85 speed and being generally bad and dying. Um, Phalanx doesn't have built-in speed control like Blaziken, but it is like quite dedicated to setup with no retreat, which is its speed control. So it doesn't really need Tailwind. It would rather have redirection so that I can set up no retreat. Executor and down, so I'm looking at the speed column. That's 45 speed and down, so you're not really getting too much from that Tailwind anyway. So this Articuno, it's really not supporting the team. And then what else are supports? Executor. One of the big appeals of Executor is that it's one of the few Trick Room setters that's blessed by not being Ghost or Psychic, which means it's not weak to Dark or Ghost, which is really nice. But let's look at the team. Hat is the main Trick Room setter. Hat is not weak to Dark. Hat's main partner is Indeedee, which has Follow Me and is immune to Ghost. So Executor, it sets Trick Room, but I don't really necessarily understand the reason to set Trick Room with it. When are you ever when do you ever need to set Trick Room with Executor to support Hat instead of just doing your Indeedee Hat stuff? Um, so Executor a little misplaced in terms of support. Inteleon Icy Wind runs into the same problem as Articuno's Tailwind, um, because Raichu doesn't really need help. It would rather be Surge Surfer. Articuno is too weak to make use of speed control. Same with Indeedee probably. Blaziken has built-in speed control, and then the same issues as before. So Inteleon, not a great support on this team, to be completely honest. Pinkarchin has electric surge support. Again, not great on here. It's interfering with your psychic terrain. So we'll get back to that in a second, but that's a problem. So, the only Pokemon that's really supporting this team is Indeedee. There are other support options, but they feel kind of clunky. Um, but let's get back to what you should be doing. You want Pokemon that can pair with multiple allies. So let's see this. Camerupt is pairing with Typhlosion in a double eruption mode. It is pairing with Cress in Trick Room, so that's two. Crawdaunt is pairing with Cress, and then you can even go for Surprise Tailwind because it's 55 speed. So if your opponent is really committed to stopping Trick Room to stop Crawdaunt, they may have made a grave mistake, and you can Tailwind, especially this is a slow format. Crawdaunt can be an issue under Tailwind, so that works. Cress is paired with everything. It helps Camerupt and Crawdon, as I mentioned, and then in the fast mode or with screens, it can help everything else, all the other sweepers. Electivire works with Cress, like I just said. It could work with Crawdon as like a good switch partner, just because Motor Drive, but that's not a huge deal. But it works with Lumi's Tailwind, and it works with Porygon Z, we'll talk about in a second. Illumise. So Illumise works with everything. Tailwind for all of the fast mode sweepers, and Sunny Day for Leafeon, and Swagger for Purugly with that own Tempo. And then Porygon Z, like I just said, Tailwind from Illumise, and that's a lot of damage. Porygon Z is really absurdly strong, so that's a great mode. And then also Scarf Porygon Z with Discharge procs your Motor Drive on Electivire, so that's a mode. It's another mode for Porygon Z. Um, and then Purugly, any of the fast mode sweepers, give them a fast fake out. Typhlosion, Porygon Z, Leafeon even maybe, um, and then it can work or to set Trick Room with Cress, and then it can also work as a sweeper with Illumise because of the Swagger own tempo strategy. And then finally Typhlosion, I mentioned the double eruption strategy with Camerupt. And then, Cress has speed control, Illumise has speed control. Yeah, Typhlosion has a lot of stuff it can work with. So yeah, we see all of these Pokemon basically have multiple things that they're really willing to partner with, which is great for this team. And that really strengthens, we'll get to why that strengthens everything, but it's just important to see how many pairings each of these Pokemon has. And then we'll take the last 2 points together, Synergies in the cheap and the power of surprise. So, Synergies in the cheap. The main one I want to highlight is Illumise and Purugly. I believe those were Daddy's first two picks, and that's just like a very under the radar, nice swagger own tempo, fast own tempo user. That's a quality combo that commands a fair amount of respect. for really really cheap, relative to like the top tier combos. So that's those really help power up your um, wide threat bubble teams. And then, while you're getting this like little mode for your Perugly, you also add fake out support, tailwind support, prankster, and then prankster everything support. So you've added a lot of support, also. So that's really good use of value. And then the other one I want to highlight is Porygon Z. Um, he already had the tailwind, so um, Porygon Z was like pretty cheap on this tier list just because it was non-max, coming out of max. But it's really nice with the Lumais, so that's a really good way to get full use of, or like full value out of Porygon's points. And then Daddy took it a step further by adding the Electivire with the discharge mode. So you really just extracting maximum value out of all these Pokemon by giving them a lot of pairings and a lot of different ways to be used effectively. So then the power of surprise, that's the one thing that Daddy asked me to add to this presentation after I sent it to him, um, because he thought it was a big part of why this team is so strong. And I don't want to get too much into it, but basically, like if he's leading Porygon, Purugly, and Lumais, you don't necessarily know what Daddy's going to do. You have a sense that he's going to run own tempo, swagger, but you don't really know. Maybe Purugly's defiant. Maybe you have a intimidate mon that you really want to use to actually just own tempo, block, intimidate. Never mind. I don't know. That's a bad example. But basically, it's hard to tell what Daddy was going to lead, when you played him. That's a problem that I struggled with against him, just because he has so many different things he can bring, um, so many different lead combos he can bring too. And then once you see it on the field, you don't necessarily know what Daddy's going for, just because these Pokemon can all do so many different things. And that gets back to why it's so important to have your Pokemon combo with multiple different things. It really just expands the amount of combos you have. So you have a set amount of 11 Pokemon, but if you have a lot of Pokemon that work with many of their teammates, then your the amount of modes you can run is modes and combos you can run is far greater. And that plays into the wide threat bubble strategy, because the biggest strengths of wide threat bubble are your flexibility. And I mean, literally, the name of it is that wide threat bubble. You have a lot of threats. So by having your Pokemon be strong with many different partners, you're expanding the amount of threats that each individual Pokemon has runs. So Porygon Z, you have your sweeping threat, but by adding Electivire, you're expanding the threat bubble of Porygon Z itself, because now it has a discharge mode, whereas before it did not. So you're really just maximizing your flexibility. You're expanding the amount of threats that you have as much as you can to really take the advantages of having that many threats in the first place. That's why it's so strong on these wider threat bubble teams. And that's how I would recommend to build one of these teams. Then let's do the cons. Let's do this a little faster. I've been trying, this is my third shot. I'm trying to go a little faster every time. I like to talk. So, what not to do. You don't want different modes that are beat by the same Pokemon. I don't want to rail on this team too much, but if we look at the two like most threatening modes, in my opinion, Psychic Terrain, Electric Terrain. Three of the four Pokemon between these two combos are Psychic types, and the most threatening, like the sweeper in both combos, are special. So you are just going to spam Snarl into this team. Yes, there's Defiant. Yes, there's Competitive. I know. I played against it. I brought Snarl, and it like pretty much shut down the team. Snarl really good into these modes, and yeah, there are a lot of Pokemon that are really strong into both the Psychic Terrain and electric terrain modes. Even if you have like your own terrain, could be good into both modes. So that's a big issue with that team. Anti-synergy. So the biggest one, I don't think it's the only one, to be honest, but the biggest one is the whole Pincurchin nonsense. Um, you know, Pincurchin, Lightning Rod Pincurchin has value, but and you can bring it once or twice if you're drafting Pincurchin and not feel bad about it. But what I noticed with Daddy, he kept bringing Lightning Rod Pincurchin, because it simply would interfere with his strongest two Pokemon from functioning at their best, at their like best. So he was really forced into using Lightning Rod, which stops him from getting full value out of Pincurchin, and especially because he's paying for, terrain is a premium thing in draft. So like much of Pincurchin's price is its Electric Surge. So if you're foregoing that ability most of the time that you're bringing it, you're really losing out on a lot of value. Same thing with Raichu Alola. Its only ability is Surge Surfer. But if you don't want electric terrain up, you're essentially losing your ability. Um, you still have the value of Fake Out, you still have the value of Expanding Force and Speed Swap and everything it can do, but you don't have that Surge Surfer Rising Voltage. You don't have that because you don't want electric terrain up, and that's because of the anti-synergy. So with these wide threat bubble teams, you really don't want anti-synergy. And then another thing I had on the other side was rigid synergies. So Hatterene and Didi, pretty rigid. Um, you can envision Hatter like Indeedee works with everything on this team because it's Indeedee, but Hatterene doesn't really work with anything else on this team. Uh, maybe Raichu for fake out, but the only thing I could really envision Hatterene working with is like some intimidate fake out Pokemon, which is missing from this team. Um, you know, the there's maybe not inherent rigidity with Heterine in DD. There's certainly a degree of it, but it's really the team around it that helps set in that rigidity. Um, yeah, and like Phalanx always wants Indeedee, Blaziken always wants Indeedee. A lot of these Pokemon only like always want Indeedee next to them, which makes the play really, really rigid. You need to bring Indeedee every week basically, because like what does Executor prefer next to it over Indeedee? Nothing. Like very few situations you want anything next to it, Executor versus instead of Indeedee. So that's a big problem I see with this team. You have really rigid building. You have really rigid duos, modes, combos, which really holds this team back. So why does that hold this team back? So the anti synergy and the rigid synergy, those hold the team back because the goal of the wide threat bubble is to be really flexible. It's to have a lot of different things you can do. And when you have anti synergy or rigid synergy, it's really limiting what you allow yourself to bring. So you need Indeedee on the team every week. And if you have Indeedee Hat on the team, which you probably want because it's your best Pokemon, your Pincurchin and Raichu, you might want them, but you want them in a weakened form maybe. So that really restricts those Pokemon. If you have Indeedee Hat, maybe you don't want Inteleon, just because it doesn't really fit with those Pokemon. Um, so it really stops you from making full use of all of the bringable Pokemon you have, right? So main takeaways I want from this video are um, basically when you're drafting wide threat bubble, what I would aim to do, and you know, feel free to disagree with me in the comments or add on or whatever. I'm certainly not perfect, but what I would recommend is play to wide threat bubble strengths. Draft in a way that really highlights the strengths of the style that you're drafting in. And you know, you definitely don't have to draft wide threat bubble. I think I lean a little more top heavy. Top heavy and wide threat bubbles. Neither is um, objectively better or worse than the other. Draft in whatever style you want. This is just sort of a guide to think about how to optimize your drafts when you're drafting top heavy, or when you're drafting wide threat bubbles, or to think more clearly about what your trade-offs are, and just to get you thinking about the draft and thinking about these things, um, thinking about things like modes and combos. I really hope this was helpful. Thanks.